أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Dear viewers, respected Sheikh, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaykum salam wa rahmatullah.
A brief introduction on Sheikh Anwer Jaffer. He was born in London and then moved to Dar es Salaam, spent a few years of his childhood here, and then moved back to London where he completed his primary, secondary, and university, studying economics in the University of London. Sheikh then moved to Najaf and then Qum for Hausa studies, where he is highly specialized in education. And then he completed his master's in Warwick University, specializing again in Islamic education. Currently, Sheikh Anwer Jaffer is the resident alim of Hujjat Jamaat in London. Sheikh, karibu sana.
Asante.
It's a pleasure to have you here, Sheikh, especially in these holy nights of Mahi Ramadan. And we've really been benefiting a lot from your lectures every night.
Asante.
In this age that we live in, and allow me to use this as a segue to introduce our topic, which is technology, spirituality, and AI. How we can manage, or how do we navigate ourselves spiritually in the digital age. Starting off with that keyword, the digital age. We live in a world where now we are crossing between our physical life and our digital life. But unfortunately, sometimes we forget that our true life is our spiritual life. And with that in mind, this sort of trifecta of three lives that we're trying to live and juggle on a daily basis, sometimes we end up facing an imbalance, especially as the youth. Am I more inclined towards living in the digital sphere, i.e. living online, or am I more benefited in showing up to the majlis, exercising my physical senses to their full capacity and attending majalis, or now am I retreating into my spiritual self and trying to reflect and work from the inside out, especially in Mahi Ramadan? If I were to bring that to you, Sheikh, what do you feel is the best way forward, especially in this digital age, for us youth to sort of strike a balance or lean towards what is more preferential?
First and foremost, thank you for the invitation. This discussion is very important because I am starting to understand that people do not realize how profound the digital age is and how it's expanded, especially in the past 2-3 years, especially with the introduction of AI and so on. But just as you mentioned in your question, there has to be an acknowledgement. People need to realize the relationship between the access of information that we have and how that can lead to spirituality. Even broader beyond that, having physical interactions with people in the community, can that be replaced? Where a person sits at home and exposes themselves to the information, whether it be online, whether it be on TV, and so on. In my opinion, it doesn't. It doesn't nurture spirituality, because spirituality in itself is an entire process best achieved when people interact with one another. So having that community where you are engaging with members within the community, beyond that, even if it may be positive interactions or even negative interactions, both of which can be used as a platform for the individual to grow. To isolate oneself, to stay at home and to simply tune on YouTube, for example, to listen to a majlis, it doesn't give you the exposure which you would otherwise get by attending a majlis. Many years ago, people used to have this conversation, especially creating that contrast between how men engaged within the community and how women engage in the community, where it's quite comical because, back in the days when men would listen to the majlis, the Maulana would be there on the minbar and they would have access communication with the member, right? Seeing and experiencing it firsthand live, there's a different ethos to it in comparison to just watching it on the TV. And so the questions were raised. Well, the women have been watching majalis on the TV, and that's not as effective as, the members, men, when they engage in the community.
Yeah.
But now, even now, with the rise of technology, even when I see men coming to the center, they don't look at me giving the majlis, they look at the TVs. All right? So there's that transition that's been created.
Yeah.
Not saying it's bad or good, but beyond that, what's happened is that people are more comfortable staying at home and acquiring information by viewing whatever's there on the screen. The argument that I'm making is that the most effective way of acquiring information
Yeah.
over the screen, over any digital platform, more so than actually interacting with the presence of others, the presence of the Maulana, and then obviously beyond the majlis, interacting with individuals around you. So it's a very interesting question. Does it replace spirituality? I don't think it does. Because spirituality in itself is an entire process. And to engage in that process alone, in isolation, it's not healthy. And I just wish that people come to the understanding that it's much more better to physically come to the center, engage, and then kind of see how that takes them over the next 10, 20 years.
I feel one thing that I really found interesting from what you've responded to is the fact that spirituality is a process, and it is in fact better achieved when done as a community.
Yeah.
Or in a gathering. In today's world, as you know, technology in one way connects us, but in one way also isolates us,
Yeah.
as you mentioned, right? So it can connect us digitally while isolating us physically. And I think we can all see that happening throughout the Shia world, where we're all connected online, but then when it comes to physically in the centers, the attendance not being that reflective of our spirits. And also within the majalis, as you mentioned, people are now getting distracted by looking at the TV rather than the Maulana. Social media in itself, Sheikh, it seems to have quite a bit of a destructive nature.
Yeah.
And with the youth today not being able to sort of live without social media, what would you say is the best way to navigate that space so that we can remain as a community people who gain advantage from technology, but we do not get distracted by it, as hard as it may seem?
So, in my perspective, when you look at all the studies that are done regarding social media,
Yeah.
right? Social media has been, as you mentioned, I can't remember the word that you used. Was it destructive or distractive? Right? Both.
Both.
It's destructive and it's
Yeah.
distractive.
Yeah.
When Facebook first launched, back when I was in university, it was launched with the idea of connecting people. And then after that, Instagram, after that, Twitter, and so on and so forth, what's happened is that within society itself, people are so much involved in social media more than they are in public.
Yes.
Right? You have keyboard warriors and whatnot. All of these phenomena just began to appear.
Yeah.
And the studies are explaining that people are worse off mentally, emotionally. People are more lonelier than before. Imagine the irony that social media is supposed to connect people, was meant to connect people, but now the opposite has happened. It's
Yeah.
isolated people.
Yeah.
Now you have new phenomena where people aren't able to socialize. So now social skills have dropped and depleted substantially. Social media in itself has not brought about anything positive to the wider society. Now, some may argue and say, well, we have a lot of information, Islamic information. Tabligh has increased substantially on social media. It has, right? I can't argue against that. But I feel that we've entered a time where people have so much access to information, they don't know how to process that information. You could imagine a child, right? If you throw a deluge of knowledge to that child, the child doesn't know what to do with that knowledge. And I feel that we're in the same situation. There's so much knowledge out there, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we have access to knowledge, right? There's a difference between access to information and access to knowledge.
Okay.
The diverse knowledge that's out there and information, it becomes hard for the person to actually process not only just not just what's right knowledge and what's wrong knowledge, but how effective can this knowledge be in my life at a practical level? That's what Islam endorses, right?
Yeah.
That whenever you come across information, if you want to acquire knowledge that is beneficial. Don't just acquire it for the sake of acquiring it when it doesn't benefit you in any way whatsoever.
Yeah.
And I find people have gone down this route. They have an interest in a particular study, they will study, only to find in the end that it was just an intellectual, a hobby kind of approach.
Yeah. A discourse.
An intellectual discourse. They were attracted to it, but then after, I don't know, 5-6 years, it doesn't benefit them. And then they move on to something else.
Yeah.
So that distinction has to be made. What sort of knowledge is beneficial for me? What sort of information is beneficial for me that can then lead to my spiritual growth? I think the most effective way to navigate around that is having interactions with people, having interactions with scholars. But we'll come to that in the course of the discussion, inshallah.
Yeah. Ahsantum Sheikh, I wanted to bring us back to a particular point that you made in your previous answer, that people are now using technology or social media to do tabligh, and in fact, instead of doing benefit, they might even be doing harm to society.
Yeah.
If we were to delve into that a little bit more, I know nowadays a lot of people are very much attracted to posting Islamic content online, some even going further by making their own pages and their own accounts based on Islamic content and knowledge. My question is, how can this be potentially dangerous to the Ummah, in the sense that people without the right knowledge, without the guidance of scholars, coming forward and posting Islamic content in the name of tabligh? And what can we do to make sure to tell them as a community, to make them aware of these dangers without sort of offending them and stopping or dampening their flame?
Yeah, I think that's an important point that you raise. If you look at the structure of a community, right, we're at a stage where there is no active engagement in adult education. So when it comes to children, we have the best of madrasas, we have a very robust system to teach our children, but once they graduate from the madrasa, there is no active engagement in Islamic education, and the only education you get is from the mimbar. Now, there's an issue with this. The issue is people have their own interests.
Yeah.
Right? What I'm interested in terms of the world, in terms of Islamic education, may not necessarily align with what your interests are. So when I come down to the majlis and I see that the Maulana is not talking about something that is of an interest to me, I turn off. Right? But that's as far as it goes. Majority of the people, there are minorities who engage in adult education by signing up to a workshop, online Hausa, for example. So they make that initiative, but for the majority of them, regardless of what the reason is, they don't engage in adult education.
Yes.
Social media provides that platform for them.
Yeah.
Right? It makes sense. So there is that benefit that social media provides.
Yeah.
So whatever I'm interested in, I'll easily have access to that information.
Yeah.
The only problem that I have with this is that when you look at Islamic education, again, it's an entire process, right? If the foundations of my understanding of Tawheed, my understanding of Nabuwah, my understanding of the justice of God is wavered, or it's weak, or I know that more needs to be done, if I ignore that and then focus on something else that I'm interested in, it could be Imam Mahdi, it could be, for example, Wilaya, Imama, it could be polemical debates, it could be Christianity versus Islam, whatever it may be, there will come a time when I will question my own faith. Right? It's a natural process that we all go through.
Yeah.
But essentially, there has to be importance in me kind of building my framework, building my foundations to a level where I'm comfortable engaging in topics that I'm interested in.
Yes. Yes.
So the madrasa does provide that platform, but there's only so far that the madrasa can go. Again, you're looking at the age, the maturity of children. When you look at adults, again, their experiences define what their interests are.
Yeah.
Right? And our interests, naturally, they tend to change every 2 to 3 years.
Of course.
if I, as a single person, I have an interest in a particular topic, the moment I get married and I have exposure, in marital life, my interests change. As soon as children come into the picture, you find currently there's an expansion of tarbiyah,
Yes.
right? People have that interest now because they have children.
Yeah.
But again, to engage in tarbiyah, I need to understand what the roots of religion are effectively for me to then be able to transmit that knowledge onto my children.
Yeah.
Social media has had a massive impact on the younger generation. But I feel that, the parents have taken a back seat and have left their children to kind of, they've given children the autonomy to have exposure to the information that's there on social media.
Yeah.
And to navigate all of that at a communal level and the challenges that are associated with it becomes very, very difficult.
Yeah.
So, one of the ways of tackling that is by empowering the parents, empowering the teachers in the madrasa to, essentially give information that is necessary for the youths or for their teenagers. So yeah, I mean, social media in itself is beneficial. It's very, very beneficial because it gives you information that you're interested in.
Of course.
But again, it comes back to this root question: the information that I'm exposed to, how much of a benefit is it for me practically?
Yes.
We live in a day and age. I mean, naturally, as human beings, we have the power of influence. I'm sure some of you may have even experienced this. You're influenced by the opinions of your friends. So even if something, even if you don't have an interest in any subject, for example, just by the exposure of what your friends are talking about, you'll have that motivation to go and read up on something that you never had an interest on. Social media is the same thing. It pulls you in different directions. Again, you're now part of a system that is effectively pulling you in different directions.
Yeah, 100%. Sheikh, I wanted us to look into this whole idea of information versus knowledge. I know you just mentioned it, right? Information is readily available. In fact, it's ubiquitous. In fact, it is overloaded in today's society. We are living in an age of information overload where people are now getting confused. They have so much choice. Even when it comes to Islamic lectures, for example, right? Ramadan, you open up YouTube and you find such a plethora of different shuyukh that are giving lectures, different topics, different spheres, that someone can sometimes then pick one every day and literally be watching different lectures every day. As a resident alim, as a lecturer, for example, here in Dar es Salaam, you visited us for 15 days. What is the importance of carrying through and really taking information and turning it into knowledge? I feel like people today, they leave it halfway, or they just they cherry pick what they are interested in terms of information, or the snippets that social media gives us are just the highlight reels. What is the importance of us actually taking the discipline, taking the time, patiently taking a topic and dissecting it to its fullest?
Yeah, I mean, that's a problem that we currently face everywhere in the world. Every community has this challenge. I think the fundamental question you need to ask is, what is the role of the member? All right, what is the role of the Maulana who delivers a lecture? When you are sitting in front of a gathering of 2,000, 3,000 people, naturally you will have people with different interests. And as I mentioned, if you don't talk based on what the individual is interested in, you've shut them off. So there's baggage that this individual has come into the center expecting the Maulana to talk about something that he's interested in. And if he finds that the Maulana is not talking about what he's interested in, there are issues. Now imagine, multiply that by 3,000 people who are listening to the lecture.
Of course.
And multiple thousands online who are listening to the lecture. Right? What is the role of the member? When you look historically into the sermons of the Ahlul Bayt, the sermons of the Prophet of Islam, they never used to engage in giving majalis for 40 minutes, 45 minutes. Their sermons were short. You turn to Nahj al-Balagha, for example. Nahj al-Balagha, there are some entire sermons that the Imam used to give, and they were relatively short. You look at the khutbah of Bibi Fatima, it's no more than 15 minutes.
Wow.
The khutbah of Ghadir was the longest sermon, and that was roughly 40 minutes. Right? 40 minutes publicly on Ghadir Qawm, where the Prophet delivered the sermon of Ghadir.
Yeah.
The idea of giving hour-long lectures
Yeah.
wasn't something that was prevalent during that time.
Interesting.
Education was more active. It was more of a dialogue than it was a monologue. Now, am I saying that we need to move to a more dialogue program within our centers, to develop a more dialogue program within the centers? No, because we've transitioned into this, and there is goodness that we can take from listening to a lecture.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that people need to be motivated to say, you know what, I've just sat in a lecture. Maulana has mentioned this point. I found it very interesting. Let me go and do more research on it. Let me go on alislam.org. Let me go down to the local library. Let me, see what the Western idea on the subject is.
Yeah.
To then do their own reading.
Yeah.
To then formulate questions. To then come back to the Maulana and say, I read up on this. What do you think? Listening to a 50-minute lecture can provide that for the person, but it's just that the person needs to have that motivation to do more. One of the things that I'm really scared of is that we have nurtured ourselves to learn about Islam purely from the minbar. That's the only avenue for us to gain Islamic knowledge. In terms of reading, no one reads now. We have a lot of publications. 20 years ago there was this whole discussion on should we start translating the books of the ulama from Arabic and Farsi into English. 20 years ago. Now a lot of books are being translated, but these books aren't being bought. Right? People aren't interested in reading. The other issue is, if people are interested in reading, they don't study it. They read it as if it's a novel. Right? We all have Nahj al-Balagha in our houses, so we just read page by page by page. If you refer to the explanations of Nahj al-Balagha, there are hours and hours and hours of content. The Sharh, exactly. You take a sermon or a maxim or a saying of the Imam and you dissect it in such a way where that information can be a part and parcel of your life. Again, it all comes back to individual responsibility.
Definitely.
Right? So, again, when you come back to the question, what's the role of the minbar? The role of the minbar is not for me as the Maulana or the speaker to spoon feed you information. Yeah?
Definitely.
I don't like that. I don't like to spoon feed you with information. So I would give you a question which is often an open-ended question, so that you go back, you reflect on it, you do more research on it.
Sheikh, right now that you mentioned, for example, people taking an approach beyond the minbar, people doing their own research. I want to ask you about AI and ChatGPT, for example, right? Because if I were to be asked this question, or any, for example, member of the public, from the youth especially, were be to ask this question, that Sheikh has given you a lecture, you have extracted a certain amount of knowledge from it, and you are now tasked, or you are now responsible to yourself to then further your knowledge on this information. I would straight away go and plug this into ChatGPT and instantly receive, my information. I can tailor it. I can use AI to customize that information. And a lot of us then use that as our knowledge, or as our secondary source of knowledge. Right? What are the benefits of using that, as well as what are some of the dangers of relying or over-relying on AI in terms of our spiritual development, in terms of our acquisition of knowledge?
So the answer can be two-part. Before we mentioned there's a difference between information and knowledge.
Yes.
Right? When you bring in the whole role of spirituality, how is knowledge transmitted? I think that's the question that needs to be asked. How can knowledge be transmitted? If you look at the narrations of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, and when you actually dissect these narrations, you come to an understanding that AI does not replace scholars. Alright? The role of AI right now is to give you information, is to dissect the information for you, Beyond that, it can even answer many of the shubahat, many of the questions that you have.
Yeah.
It's very effective in doing that.
Yeah.
You plug in any question in AI, any theological question, it will have the ability to give you the answer as envisaged by our imams and our scholars. Well, the argument I'm making is AI does not replace scholars.
Definitely.
So there's an idea here. Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam presents this. He says that if a scholar does not act according to what he preaches, right? And there are ayat in the Holy Quran. Why do you say that which you do not practice? Now, when you have a scholar that talks about something that he does not practice, the Imam is explaining. He says that his words will reach the ears of his audience.
Yes.
It will enter one ear and it will come out the other ear. He says, however, when you come across a scholar who practices what he preaches,
Yeah.
it will enter the ear and it will rest in the heart of the listener. Right? So that transformative change of knowledge and how it's transmitted, there is an idea that's presented here. The knowledge itself,
Yeah.
and the carrier of the knowledge.
Okay.
Right? So now when you talk about AI carries AI has that information, but it doesn't necessarily carry the knowledge.
Yeah.
Right? So if anyone was to come to the conclusion and say, look, AI has allowed us to have access to so much information, there is no guarantee that information will be beneficial to you. It will answer a lot of the questions for you very, very effectively, but will that knowledge help you become a spiritual person? Will it help you develop taqwa? So this is a discussion that links back to the broader themes of taqwa, spirituality.
Yeah.
Right? When you look at the ethos of the Quran does this beautifully. It talks about previous stories, it talks about prophets, it talks about despots and kings who were corrupt.
Yeah.
And all of these are used as archetypes for us today. So Allah is effectively telling us, look, there are good role models that existed for you, and there are role models who you should examine their lives, learn how not to be like them. So the whole approach of the Quran is that there are role models for you, archetypes, right? AI doesn't necessarily gives you that platform to take it as a role model, simply put.
Yeah.
We as human beings, we better ourselves by mimicking others. We observe the lives of others. If someone is very materialistic, they will look towards a person who's really affluent and say, what is he doing that has made him successful? Let me mimic what he does.
Yeah.
Let me follow the same path. Again, it comes down to this whole aspect of role modeling.
Definitely.
AI doesn't provide that. So although you have access to so much information, beyond that, will that information really and truly be effective for the individual? So it's a question that needs to be discussed, right? It needs to be discussed much more openly. I mean, clearly the benefits of AI is that it answers a lot of questions for you very, very quickly.
Yeah.
Another question that arises is, back in the days, people, if they had a question, for example, they would spend weeks trying to find the answer.
Yeah.
Yeah? They would spend weeks. They would have this question, it's bugging them, they lose sleep over it, they visit scholars until they come across an answer that they are satisfied with. Today, in this day and age, if someone has a question and they don't find an effective answer to it, rather than having the patience to find an answer, they would ask AI. What if AI is not able to give them the answer that is satisfiable? Then you'll see that people react in many different ways. Yeah, maybe it's not important. Why should I do it when there is no effective answer that's there?
Definitely.
So it's an interesting discussion to talk about.
So much to unpack, Sheikh. Especially the fact that you mentioned the way AI cannot replace a scholar, especially the point about us as a community, as individuals, needing to mimic or see a role model in order to develop ourselves, our character, and by extension, our spirituality, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Sort of, when we discuss AI right now and we discuss the ease that AI has brought to us, right? And you mentioned that sometimes when people get a question in the past, they used to spend a lot of time, a lot of effort to uncover an answer. That creates some sort of fortitude, that creates a level of discipline, perseverance in a person.
Yeah.
Do you think we are at risk now, Sheikh, with the modern ease that we have and all the sort of tools at our disposal, that now we are becoming more relaxed in a day and age where our enemies are becoming stronger and stronger? The distractions in the world are getting stronger and stronger, and our fortitude as a Muslim ummah, our perseverance in uncovering the truth, is getting weaker and weaker.
No, I agree. I agree. The idea of having the discipline to research
Yeah.
has depleted substantially.
Mm.
Um, having so much access to that information has made work so much easier.
Yes.
I think the overall discussion is how effective can this be within Islamic education, within Islamic studies?
Yeah.
We have access to that information.
Yeah.
But it's so easy to have access to that information that people can literally bypass an entire process of studying, achieve the answer very, very quickly.
Yeah.
Modern day discussions right now, there is an entire discussion whereby people are arguing whether AI nurtures the mind
Mm.
effectively, allows people to engage in critical thinking. From my own personal experience, if you expose yourself to knowledge, it becomes difficult. A wide range of knowledge, right, with differences of opinions. It becomes difficult to process that information, but it also becomes difficult to kind of challenge the information that's given.
Yeah.
It's becoming much more difficult as well. I can't imagine how difficult it would be for someone who doesn't have the foundations, and are very exposed to that level of information. There are positives. Definitely, there are positives, but again, it does deplete one's discipline.
100%. Sheikh, now let's say we're speaking to a youth, early youth, even for example, children in madrasa, for
Yeah.
example, because at the moment, what we're talking about now is going to be affecting them in the years to come. And essentially, it is our responsibility, the way we've received from our elders
Yeah.
and our scholars, to pass it down to our youngsters, to our younger brothers and sisters who are now challenged with this whole overload of information and accessibility. What are the key skills or practices that you would suggest to a young adolescent, teen, by general category, a youth, to develop that muscle, that mind muscle of acquiring knowledge the right way, if I were to put it like that?
In the Hausa, they would explain that knowledge and acquiring knowledge has a whole spiritual background to it.
Okay.
That rather than just sitting on the floor, opening the book and reading and memorizing and writing notes and summarizing, that's an effective way of learning.
Yeah.
But that doesn't necessitate that you will acquire knowledge. There's a difference between the two. You look at the narrations, knowledge is interpreted as nur, the light of Allah, the divine light. I mentioned this the other night. Amir al-Mu'mineen says to Kumail, he says, Ya Kumail, your heart is like a vessel. And the best vessels are the vessels which are large and expansive. If a person engages in tazkiyat an-nafs, he purifies himself, cleanses his heart. AI doesn't provide that for you. When he cleanses his heart and then he fills that heart with knowledge, information, it can transform into knowledge that has practical implications. All right? I think all of this needs to be in one's mind. If you look at a youth who is studying for whatever exam, you look at, for example, how our formative scholars used to study, the likes of Sheikh Tusi. You have this entire publication, Munyat al-Murid. They would focus on what you need to do, the adab, the etiquettes, before starting to study. So some of them had the opinion of wearing white clothes.
Okay.
Performing wudu, reciting Torah as-salah before studying. Now you're spiritualizing the whole approach to acquiring information. There are du'as. The one du'a that we recite in salah أعوذ بالله من علم لا ينفع. I seek the protection of Allah from the knowledge that is not beneficial. Right? So there's a whole spiritual approach in acquiring information. If you ask the question as to what AI can provide for us, there's an entire spiritual backdrop that is or can be potentially ignored. If you want to maximize and benefit from AI, adhere to the spiritualities that are associated with it. It could help. That knowledge is in the hands of Allah, that divine knowledge. He can give it to whomever He wishes.
In essence, I think we're drawing the distinction between worldly physical knowledge and divine Islamic knowledge, and I think it's very important for anyone and everyone who wants to seek knowledge from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Divine Islamic knowledge should be characterized as a whole different realm rather than just a subject. I feel like right now all of us think of, for example, if we were to bring it back to a school example, we have mathematics, physics, biology, Islam. While Islam is not just a subject, rather it's a whole way of life, it's a realm, it's an existence. Like you mentioned, it's nur, it's light. And although AI can be very beneficial in giving us information on different topics, or rather making topics easy to understand, for example, a concept in mathematics, when it comes to Islam, there's much more that needs to occur for us to acquire knowledge. Sheikh, you mentioned that knowledge, Islamic knowledge, carries a spiritual effect. So how can we now use that spiritual effect to prepare for our current situation, the current distractions that we have, and also for the future generations that are now coming, that inshallah, if not our generation, then those that come, who will eventually be the helpers and the ansar of Imam Sahib al-Asri wa Zaman. How can we now bring that idea forward to them, that listen, knowledge, Islamic knowledge is important, needs to be acquired in the right way, and furthermore needs to be under the guidance of a scholar? How can we get that message across to the youth?
So that's an interesting point you mentioned, that knowledge has to be under the guidance of a scholar. You can imagine a fisherman, right? A fisherman who knows how to navigate the seas, he knows exactly where to go to fish. He knows where the schools of fish are. Whereas a person who is not trained will enter the ocean and he will just go anywhere and everywhere to try and find fish. So knowledge, like the vastness of the ocean, once you enter, it can pull you into many different directions. And whatever you're looking for, you won't be able to achieve because of its vastness. The scholar will be able to effectively guide you and say, forget all the different routes that are there, go to this place here, you'll find the answer. There's an interesting narrative about Al-Ghazali. Ghazali is very, very interesting as a figure to study. He's highly regarded within the Sunni school of thought. Now, if you read his history, he used to be the senior judge. And he had a very good position within the courts. And then they say that he had a midlife crisis and he became a Sufi, or he started to engage with the Sufi traditions. And then he came back and continued his tenure as the senior judge, right? Because he was a scholar well ahead of his time, towards the end of his life, a friend sent him a letter. And he said that, look, my son wants to go down the same path as you. What do you advise him? So he wrote a letter in response, and it's been published, right? It's in English as well. Ya Bunayya, oh my son. So it's a series of advices that he gives to this young child who wants to go down this route of becoming a scholar. And one of the advices he gives, he says that, when you look at the average layman within the community, how much Islamic knowledge do you need to have? Right? If you have an interest and an inclination to become a doctor, how much Islamic knowledge do you need to have? You can't cater to both. One doesn't want to become a mujtahid or a senior scholar and likewise become a doctor. You're looking at two different lives here, right? So his advice, which is very, very interesting, I'm not saying it's right, nor am I saying it's wrong. He says stick to the basic traditions of fiqh.
Okay.
Know what's halal and haram.
Yeah.
And there's wisdom behind that, right?
Yeah.
And he says solidify your aqidah.
Yeah.
Know what you believe in and why you believe in it.
Yeah.
And these two simultaneously will nurture you to become a good human being. Even if you are a doctor, even if you sell insurance, it doesn't matter. You will become a good human being.
Yes.
If you look at the premise of knowledge, what makes me a knowledgeable person? Again, if we interpret knowledge, ilm, as nur, it's not about acquiring information through reading, memorizing, summarizing, all of these things. Because the outcome of nur is through practicing what you know.
Yeah.
What does that mean, practicing what you know? Stay away from the haram, adhere to the wajibat. You know, many of us, we go to Najaf, for example, right? And it becomes a thing to go and meet the marj of our time.
Yeah.
We go into the office after the securities, we go into the office and we ask him the one question. Every group asks this question. It's like in your experience of learning Islam for the past 80 years, what do you advise us? Right? You're asking him to summarize 80 years of studies into one sentence, and his sentence is profound. Stay away from the haram, adhere to the wajibat.
Absolutely.
It's such a simple statement. It's like we teach our 5-year-olds in madrasa.
Yeah.
Right? This exact ethos, but it's very difficult to implement it.
Of course.
And when a person has or reaches the level where he's mastered it, naturally he will acquire information that he wouldn't have acquired through books. It opens his mind, it opens his heart. Hence, the heart is a vessel. Allah will fill it with nur to whomever He wishes. If we want to be the soldiers of the Imam, to be the representative of his movements, it comes back to the basic ethos. You know, to develop a discipline in our lives where we behave according to how Allah wants us to behave. To mold our lives the way Allah wants us to live. Right? It's a simple formula, but very difficult to master.
Yeah. No, definitely. Definitely. I feel like most of the profound realities in our world are just that they're simple. But in order to implement them, in order to bring that into yourself, it takes a whole journey.
It does.
Right? And speaking of journey, I feel like most of us now feel like we're at the beginning stage, we're at the edge, like the edge of the cliff in terms of diving into Islam, in terms of taking ourselves further. And we're further encouraged by technology, by AI, to take the leap and become a better Muslim, a better person. But I feel like from what you've mentioned in terms of fulfill the wajibat, avoid the muharramat, and take that path, we find ourselves sometimes finding it too easy, right? I think the funny thing is, because of all these complex realities that AI has given us access to, that social media gives us access to, if I were to go on a limb to say, for example, a topic as complex as mysticism, that people tend to now dissect or attempt to dissect or attempt to internalize, we find ourselves forgetting the basics. And I feel like throughout our discussion, you've mentioned the basics need to be strong. Whether you are doing tabligh, whether you are attempting to gain knowledge for yourself, for your family, for those who depend on you, or whether or not you're just trying to become a better person, the foundations need to be strong. And the foundations are wajib, haram. I feel like now we need to bring that message forward, Sheikh, to the youth, to the communities, to start simple and not aim for everyone to become a scholar. Not that that is not something that someone should pursue. However, they should understand that scholarship is a journey in itself. That a few, I think it's mentioned in the Quran as well, that from amongst you, someone should go and study Islam. Right? But however, that doesn't mean that the rest of us should just sit back and wait for that person to come back and answer all our questions. Right? As you mentioned, the mimbar should not be a platform to spoon feed the public. Sheikh, with your parting thoughts, Alhamdulillah, we've managed to unpack quite a few different discussions, and I really, really appreciate your guidance and your insight. What could be a take home message, a point of action, a point of spark for the youth, for the viewers, for myself as well, inshallah? What can we take away from this, and what can we take forward into our lives, especially given the fact that we are in the month of Ramadan, the blooming grounds for spirituality?
I think I think it's necessary at this stage to kind of motivate people to take Islamic education into their own hands.
Okay.
And by that, I mean whenever you come across a piece of information, reflect on it, ponder on it. Don't let the reflection be done by AI, right? But for you to actively sit down, think about it.
Yeah.
Even if it means sitting down with a pad or a pen and paper,
Yeah.
write down the different thoughts that you have.
Yeah.
Try and explore it using your own mind. Try and do your own research. I think just having that motivation to do so, especially in this day and age, can be very, very difficult.
Yeah.
But the moment you start that journey, it is difficult in the beginning, but Allah makes it very much easy for you. And I think it just opens your mind in different ways. It opens your heart in different ways. Navigating through differences of opinions, how do you react to it? Having access to scholars. The scholar, by interacting with them, you may have an interest in something, and the scholar may turn around and give you a slap in the face and say, what you're interested in is not important. You may not see the wisdom behind that.
Yeah.
But then as time goes on, you may realize later on in life, well, hold on a second, it's actually true because there's no substance behind it. So I think access to scholars is crucial. It's fundamental.
Yeah.
It doesn't replace AI, as we mentioned. And sometimes they have a good insight as to how to approach information and what sort of information to have access to. Not that information in itself, other information may be wrong. It's just that you and your maturity at this stage, you should focus on A rather than on B.
Yeah.
And I think that sort of guidance is very much needed.
Well, Sheikh Anwar, thank you so much for your time, for the deep insights, as well as the practical lessons on how we can navigate our spirituality, how we can acquire divine knowledge within this challenging period of advanced technology and AI. Inshallah, we pray for your tawfiq
Inshallah,
to
Jameel.
continue down this path.
All of us, inshallah.
Ahsantum, thank you so much.
Jazakumullah. Thank you for having me.
Most welcome. Most welcome.